Welcome to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast, all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host, Sarah Schaefer from the Yale School of Medicine. Today, as part of the Arts in Neurology series, we will be speaking about writing with Ellie Sternberg, epileptologist and chief of neurology at Milford Regional Physicians Group in Massachusetts, and author of several books, including Neurologic, My Brain Made Me Do It, and Are You a Machine? And Aaron Berkowitz, a neurologist in California and author of One by One by One. Both of these neurologists have used their passion for neurology in their writing, though in very different ways. Thank you for joining us, Aaron and Ellie.
Thanks for having us.
So, Aaron, why don't we start with you? At what point in your career did you start writing? Was it always an interest? What or who inspired you?
So I was actually pretty averse to writing. I was a pretty typical college pre-med and tried to avoid any course where I would have to write a paper, and was glad we didn't have to write many in medical school. And then, longer story, but decided during medical school I wasn't sure if I was going to finish or not, and decided to go to graduate school for music, where I had to write a lot of papers, and I was pretty bad at it actually, and didn't appreciate all the red ink that I got, but had some dedicated mentors that helped me learn how to write in the humanities context, and really started to enjoy both writing and editing, and got sort of into it. I didn't have any plans really to make it part of my career per se. And then the patient stories who I tell in the book that you mentioned, I found just so compelling and so moving, and had sort of so much to unpack, that as they were evolving, I sort of thought a lot of people could learn from this, and I'd love to try to write about it. So that's sort of how I started to try to do this.
How about you, Ellie?
I had a bit of an early exposure to writing. I was in high school, and we had a final project for my English class. I think it was junior year of high school, and the assignment was to just write about anything. And I was going to write some fiction, but my dad encouraged me to write about a topic of interest and learn something in the process. So I ended up writing about consciousness, because I was inspired by this article in Scientific American about robots, and could you build robots to be conscious? And so I ended up sending that paper to a local publisher, and they were very encouraging with me. And they're like, "Oh, this is so cute. If you expanded this out, maybe we'll take a look at it." And they ended up publishing it, and then I got really excited about that, and that actually led me into neurology. So I got into the brain through writing rather than the other way around.
Wow, that's so interesting. So did you ever have formal writing education, Ellie?
I mean, at the time, I had high school English, so I guess that's sort of formal. I remember actually, I think in the book, I thanked my English teachers from high school for teaching me English so well. But that was as far as it went. I took one creative writing course in college, and then was criticized for writing about science because it wasn't expressive enough, and they wanted me to write about my feelings. So I guess the answer to that is no real formal writing education.
Well, you alluded to this a little bit about the kinds of things that interest you in your writing. You and Aaron write very differently. Aaron, your work is much more autobiographical. Ellie, you talk more about philosophical neuroscience, if you will, popular science type writing for the layperson to read. Can you give us an overview of the type of writing that interests you? Ellie, you want to start?
I'm not personally very interesting as a person. I have a very ordinary day-to-day life. So, I have interesting patient encounters, but I think my interest in writing was always in being able to do one of two things. The first was to explain a complex idea to a layperson, which is something that I was relatively good at and I enjoyed doing. And the other was sharing an exciting idea that other people might not have exposure to. I've always felt that in medicine and in science, there's gold in academic papers, but the circulation of academic papers is so narrow that most people never learn all these interesting ideas in them. And even if they had access to that paper, would they understand it? So my interest has always been in taking interesting ideas from neurology and from neuroscience, and then explaining it to someone or sharing it with someone in such a way that they both understand it and find it as interesting as I do.
Yeah, Ellie, it seems like a lot of your chapters, at least for the book that I have in front of me, Neurologic, are kind of shower thoughts, if you will. What do the blind see when they dream, and things of that nature that any person might think about as they go about their day.
Yeah, and a lot of them were just weird questions that I had. I actually would develop this list of questions that I thought that were kind of wacky, and I actually started looking into them and see if any of them actually had good research behind them. And I had a list of maybe 100 of them. Most of them didn't go anywhere, but there were a dozen or so that actually had a lot of research behind them. And I started on this journey to learn for myself, and that's sort of what's reflected in the book.
And Aaron, your work that you've recently put out one by one is more autobiographical. What interests you about that kind of writing?
Yeah, it's interesting that you found it to be autobiographical. It was, and I'll tell you why. When I started writing this book, I was really interested in telling these patient stories for a couple of reasons. One, I think some of the early writing that got me interested in neurology was Oliver Sacks, probably a cliche, right? So many of us read Oliver Sacks at some point. And
guilty.
Yeah, I don't think we can do a podcast on writing in neurology without talking about him, or at least bringing him up.
Yeah, and I think I always just found his writing, on the one hand, obviously very fascinating, how he discusses these complex cases, but also just so human and moving, how he really not just talks about the interesting neurology, but really tries to capture the patient's experience of living with the condition they had, and is teaching us a lot more than the neurology, but something about being human. And so the stories I tell in this book are related to 3 patients who I saw in Haiti, in rural Haiti, who all had nervous system tumors, and there was no way to really care for them in Haiti. And so we decided to try to bring them to the US for care. And the book is really about all of the twists and turns and triumphs and tragedies and ups and downs of their stories. And my interest in doing this was, one, because I, as I mentioned earlier, just learned a lot from these patients. I was very inspired by them and learned a lot about their faith, as someone myself who was not very religious, but patients who were very religious, their faith, their trust, their understanding of their conditions, and wanting to get the care that they got, despite some very high risks in certain circumstances. And so, on the other hand, I think there's a lot of books about global health or humanitarian health that either paint the broad brushstrokes of poverty or suffering or disease in numbers, in terms of billions of people with this condition or millions of people that die every year from that condition, or there's sort of a hero's tale narrative like Mountains Beyond Mountains about the late extraordinary global health physician Paul Farmer. And I thought I really wanted to tell these patient stories to really zoom in on what are the faces of these sort of sometimes faceless problems, what are the voices of these sometimes voiceless individuals that are just glossed in these broad terms like the poor, or people who have this disease, or who live in poor countries, and to really show sort of what's at stake for them. And the reason I mentioned it was interesting that you said this was autobiographical, because I wanted to tell their stories and I wanted to tell some of the complexities, but I didn't want to put myself sort of at the center of it, because it was really more about their stories than mine. And when I brought this to an editor, they said, we really love the stories and there's a lot to learn from them and they're very interesting and inspiring, but we want more of you in the book. And I said, oh, but this isn't about me. And they said, but the readers will want to see not just what's happening, but more of your reflections, your sort of coming of age as a young physician, wanting to emulate people like Paul Farmer and realizing just how complicated it is. So we want you to sort of come out from behind the curtain a little more in the book and talk to the reader and talk about what you're experiencing and what you're feeling at certain moments in the book. And it wasn't intended to be autobiographical, but I was encouraged to sort of put some of that in.
Well, I think your publishers were right in the end as a reader of this book, and you certainly did accomplish putting a lot of your own growth and thought processes and internal conflict into there, and how much of a healthy dose of humility it takes to care for these patients that you were caring for.
I'm glad that came through, and I'm sure Ellie will agree that editor is always right, even if there's a first reaction that maybe I'm not sure that's what I wanted to do. Once you dive into it and think about it, you realize they're right. So I'm glad it came through as a reader as well.
Erin, I'll start with you since your book was more focused on individual patients. But Ellie, this question is also for you since you do talk a lot about different patients in your books. How do you remember these patients in such detail? Were you keeping notes and knowing that you wanted to use them in a book as you were going, or were you putting the pieces together after the fact for all of these patients? Ellie, did you have this list of 100 questions in mind, and when you saw a patient in clinic you said, this may be a good example of this, or were you doing things after the fact? And a related question, what do you do about patient confidentiality in the setting of putting these patient cases in sometimes great detail in writing and publishing that?
The main story that the book is framed around, patient's name is Janelle. When everything was happening, the last thing on my mind was writing about him. We were just trying to get him his care. And then, as I mentioned, the book is a lot of the twists and turns and unexpected things that happen and how we wrestle with what's going on and how to try to figure out how to do the right thing or what the right thing even is. And it was sort of, as things evolved, I thought, wow, I should write something about this, maybe an article. And then I thought actually probably be a book, was sort of a joke I had with myself that it's such a complicated thing, it would take a whole book. And I mentioned it to a few people who really encouraged me to do that. So a lot of the things that happened, to be honest, were just so memorable. Of course, our memories are not perfectly accurate, but I think that's part of how we learn medicine, and especially neurology, right? Because we can think of a disease or a physical exam sign and remember a very moving and vivid patient encounter where we learned about that or where we saw something we had read about. So most of that was reconstructed from memory. There were also so many emails that went back and forth about this patient and what was happening and how were we going to get him to Boston and back to Haiti and which surgeon was going to do the surgery and when, and all these things that I sort of did my own, I called it my archival research, where I went back through my emails and said, oh, right, I forgot that whole story. I should tell that piece. And then while I was sort of starting to reconstruct all that was when the other patient stories were sort of beginning. So it was actually very interesting thinking about those patient stories with a writer's lens in addition to a clinician's lens. So when I would go to Haiti and realize I'm going to need to describe what it looks like and feels like to walk down this dirt road, which I had done, thousands of times, I would be looking around saying, oh, there's this many steps between this, and there's this detail here. And similarly with the patients, I think, oh, what just happened is, I need to make a note to write about that. So it was a little bit of retrospect and a little bit of doing it as I went. And as far as the patient confidentiality, that's a great question. When I started thinking about writing about these patients, I asked them, I'm thinking about telling your story, and here's why I'm thinking of telling it, because I think some of the ideas I mentioned to you before about what does it mean to pursue global health equity, what does it mean to try to be in solidarity with patients, what is at stake, and then learning from these patients just how incredibly resilient they were and incredibly just inspiring in terms of their faith and their pursuit of their healthcare and their justice for what they deserve in terms of their care. So I talked about those aspects with them and thought that their stories could teach a lot of people and could maybe inspire more people to get involved in neurology and global health equity work, and maybe also be of some solace to patients or to who are facing similar situations, or to physicians who might be wrestling with similar dilemmas. And they were very enthusiastic about that. And still, of course, for the purpose of the publisher, we had them sign consent, but there was obviously a long discussion about that. And then there is a story in the book I wanted to tell about a patient who died, who obviously couldn't get consent from. So in that case, I just changed a lot of the details so there would be no identifying information. And so that's how I pursue that. I'm interested to hear how Ellie thinks about these things.
I mean, a lot of the really impactful cases I remember in great detail, and I don't, like Erin, I don't think about them as literary elements when I see them. It's really retrospective. There are certain cases that I remember, and when I was writing, I thought about reaching out to them and asking if I could share their story. And when I talked to them, I would ask them if they would like me to share their real name or if they want me to use a different name and change certain details so they can't be identified. With certain cases that I use as brief anecdotes, I don't always contact those patients if the story is very general and not trackable to a certain person or an institution, if it's just an example of something. But in general, I've always been really interested in narrative and in people's stories. And every time a patient comes to the hospital or comes to see me in clinic, it's always a narrative. What they come in with a problem, they seek a solution, we do an investigation, and then there's an ultimate resolution. And that three-part narrative is the same as any story.
So you've both mentioned the connections that you have with patients, the interest that you have in their stories. Can you tell me a little bit about how you find fulfillment in the actual process of writing about these stories? And also a little bit about how you feel like the process of writing might influence your practice, as I'm sure your practice influences your writing.
I think that the process of writing is an amazing complement to clinical practice. When you're in clinical practice and you're treating a patient, you're in such a prescriptive environment. There are protocols, there are algorithms, there is standard of care. You have very specific goals in mind and a lot of practical considerations. There's not a lot of room in medical documentation or in patient interactions for exploring the creative inspiration that you might have in learning about a case. And while you might think these things, sometimes you don't have the space in the moment to explore them because you have a limited time in the patient interaction and more interactions coming, whether in the hospital or in the clinical outpatient setting. When you have a moment to reflect on a case afterwards, you can have new ideas or ask questions that are not necessarily clinically relevant. Like, I wonder how this condition relates to some basic research that's going on that might not have clinical implications, but has intellectual implications. And I'm just interested as a topic. Being able to write about it gives me the space to explore those questions and serve as a creative outlet. Whereas in the clinic, I'm much more focused on getting the patient better and getting the patient the care that they need. I think the interrelation is helpful because when I have that time to explore the case afterwards, to think about my feelings on it, to look more deeply into it, and even write about all the different connections that this particular case might have to the greater breadth of neurology, when I go back and see that patient, I feel a much more well-rounded sense of their condition and how to approach them as patients.
And Aaron, what about you? How do you find fulfillment in your writing, and how do you feel that your writing may influence your practice?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear Ellie's reflections. I agree with many of those. I think it sounds like Ellie has a lot more experience writing and got a much earlier start. And so for me, I think one of the things that I found really interesting and really enjoyable in writing this book was that I had really, really no idea how to do it. So I talked to people I know who had written books or who could introduce me to people who had written books. I read books about how to write, and I didn't go to any writers' workshops, but read sort of books about what would happen in them. I read a lot of books that I had loved and tried to figure out why I loved them, or books that I liked the story but not the writing, or the writing but not the story, and tried to kind of reverse engineer them. So that whole process for me was like learning a new hobby, like deciding to learn a new musical instrument or try to train for a marathon or something like that, where you're just totally immersed in something new. And so when I was writing, it was not all fun. Writing is hard, and your inner critic comes out when you realize someone else is going to look at this. How does it sound? How does it read? Should I even be writing this? Don't I have things I'm supposed to be doing? And that's, I think, probably the same if you're trying to learn any type of new skill or instrument or sport or other hobby. But there are moments where you're writing and you realize, wow, I think I just said something in a way that really captures how I felt in that moment in a way that I maybe hadn't even articulated. Or you realize, I think I just really painted that scene in a way that I think the reader will hopefully feel similarly to how I did witnessing it, and just be either inspired or impacted in a certain way. So there's that sort of learning a craft part of it that I found very immersive, and I think things that contribute to our well-being and in the intensity of practice in the medical field are things that allow us to really focus elsewhere, because our minds are often drawn back to our work for many reasons. So that was something I enjoyed, was sort of immersing myself in the process and learning how to do something I had not really done before or known about how it is done before. How do you write a book, or how do other people do it? How do you set a scene? How do you write dialogue? Those sorts of things. And then as far as how it influences my practice, I think, in neurology, I think we're already very attuned to our patient stories, because many times our diagnosis is going to be drawn almost entirely, if not entirely, on what the patient tells us and then their exam. And so I think we're already attuned to their stories. But as I was writing about these patients, questions would come up, and I'd realize I'm not sure I ever asked them what they were thinking at this moment. I'm going to go back and ask them. And so I think that sort of loop of reflection, and then, as I mentioned, when I knew I was writing, you start looking at scenes from a writer's vantage point, or hearing a story from how would I tell this story. And I think that sort of just sharpens our attention to detail, to what it feels like in the room when you're delivering bad news, or how focused you are on a patient's story amidst the challenges of, as Ellie said, getting our notes done on time and making sure we see all of our patients. As you hear them start telling a story, or sort of that part of your brain that is interested in narrative and storytelling sort of lights up, and you can connect maybe in a way that I think we all do, but sometimes can be hard to be reminded to do in the challenges of the practice setting.
You mentioned, Aaron, that you did all of this work in preparation for your book. How did you actually find the time to write and to add this new hobby and do all this background research? How did you manage your time in order to write the book?
So the position I was in when I was writing this was mostly a neurohospitalist position. I did some outpatient work, but I was sort of either on service or off service. So I obviously didn't do any writing or thinking about writing or reading about writing when I was on service. I was fully immersed, but then I would have those periods between service where I'd have a little bit more time. And at that time when I was writing this, which was well before the pandemic, I was traveling to work in Haiti probably about 6 or 7 times a year. So I had a lot of time in airplanes and in airports and missed connections. And then actually in Haiti, we would work hard during the day, but often in the evening, there was no internet in the place where I stayed. And so it was just sort of a quiet time without the distractions of the internet and the phone, time I used to use to read. But I couldn't get, caught up on email or do all the other things we usually fill our downtime with. And so I had a lot of very quiet time there, just sort of by myself without the distraction of the internet to work on this.
If only we could get rid of the internet, we'd be so much more productive.
Sometimes.
What about you, Ellie?
I think what Aaron said is the ideal. A lot of writers say that you need a lot of consecutive time in order to write, because it's just necessary to sort of get into the flow of writing. And I definitely feel that's the ideal. It's just not always practical, especially when you're a physician writer. My favorite book on writing is called On Writing Well by William Zinsser. He always talks about the idea that when you're a professional writer, not that I'm a professional writer, but when you're a professional writer, William Zinsser, doesn't want to hear about requiring, many, many hours and inspiration and writer's block and things like that. He says, when you're a professional writer, it's hard and you have to just get down and do it and use all your time and just write. And I guess that kind of stuck with me. I did most of my writing one sentence or one paragraph at a time over a year to 3 years. The way that I got the flow of writing, despite it being so broken up, is that every time I would write and I feel the next thought or where I wanted to go next, I would just quickly write down all the places that I wanted to take the story next. So each chapter began as an incomprehensible outline. I wouldn't call it really an outline. It was just sort of stream of consciousness, but in order. And then I would add things, and it might just be a quote or a sentence or a paragraph, or it might just be a bullet point saying, write in stuff about X disorder, or use this example, or see this paper, it belongs here. And over time, I would just streamline that until it sounded like a book.
Yeah, I think those are such important points, Ellie. Yeah, the uninterrupted time, I agree, is very helpful, but it's also very daunting because it's just empty space. And then you might spend a day trying to think about something or write and feel like you didn't get to do very much. And so I agree with you. There's definitely other times where it's so helpful to have, just as we would have at the beginning of rounds, right? Your checklist of things you need to get done to sort of finish for a day and say, well, these are the things I need to do. So I would know, for example, these are the stories I know I want to write. And if I said, I have 2 hours now, I should really work on this, I'd look and say, this one, I've drafted it. Let me see if I can chip away at it and start to make it sound like something someone would want to read. And so you can sort of define those tasks for yourself when you don't have continuous time the way writers who go on retreat or go to some type of artist's retreat or something like this where they can just write continuously. I think some periods like that are really helpful for the creative process or just getting a lot of work done. But as you said, and as the writer you mentioned said, sometimes you just have to sit down and do stuff. So I found it helpful to just use the medical technique of taking a checklist and looking at it and saying, what's something I could make some progress on in 2 hours? Is that starting to outline this story? Is that taking something that's close to final and really trying to make it sing, or try to think about the overall structure of this book and what goes where? What would be what could I do in this hour or two? Because often, as you said, that's the most we're going to get for some time, and we want to keep things moving.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that will be heartening to hear for some of our listeners who might be interested in the writing process, but may look at the idea that they have to spend large chunks of time sitting down and doing the writing as an insurmountable barrier and just never get started because of it.
I'm saying this now. It's actually a lesson to myself, because the idea of writing another book it's crossed my mind, but it's again just so daunting. You only get busier with time, and every time I think I'm as busy as I could ever be, somehow it gets busier. It's reassuring to know that blank canvas of time that you can use for anything is probably not going to really come for most physicians or neurologists. So there's a way to fit it in if you just choose your tasks wisely and do it bit by bit.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think when I was getting started, one of the most important pieces of advice I got, which I alluded to earlier, was to keep a note, to read and to keep a notebook. And so sometimes you say, well, I'm tired, I'm not going to be able to write right now, or I just have a little bit of time. But I had ordered this book or gotten this book from the library that is by a physician or about a physician, or there was some reason I wanted to read it to see how this person writes about medicine or neurology, or writes about a situation of people living in poverty, as was related to my book, and how they do that, or reading fiction and trying to see how they do dialogue. So someone told me, just keep a notebook, and you see something you really like, just write it down longhand what it was, and then make a note of why you liked it, or you saw something you really didn't like, write it down longhand and mark why you didn't like it. So there's elements here for people who are getting started, whereas as Ellie said, the idea of saying, well, I'm going to write a book just feels completely impossible. And I, in many stages of this, did not think I was going to get anywhere close to a finish line. And I had to keep reminding myself that that's just part of the process, because the finish line seems very far away until you're close to it. And there was no rush. We are both practicing physicians, fortunate to not depend on the success of our writing for our livelihood. So to just keep going. But all that to say, part of the process is if you're thinking about writing and love to read, to start just reflecting on or writing about notes to yourself, or what really sounds good, or what jumps out, or what you would like to see in your own writing. I found that very helpful. I was reading a first draft of a story that I wrote that would be part of this book, and I thought, oh, this just sounds like, well, then this happened, then he said, and then she said, and then I said, and I know the story is interesting, but the writing is so boring. And I thought, well, the dialogue is awful. It's just he said and then she said, and it sounds very stilted. So as I'm reading now, I want to try to find examples of good dialogue and try to figure out why they sound good to me. And for me, what I learned is I was reading Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese, and I thought the dialogue in one passage in that book was just spectacular. And so I read it, and then I looked at it and I said, oh, after each thing someone says, there's a little note about something they did. He said, and then looked down, looked back at me, and then looked away again, or just some little piece that gives you a little visual that really makes you feel like you're there witnessing the dialogue. And so I remember writing that down and saying, oh, try to put a little bit of this, not too much, into your dialogue and see if that opens it up. Because it wasn't actually the things that people had said that weren't interesting. They were, but the dialogue just read to me as stilted. So those are parts of sort of learning how to do this that you can make time for, you might already be doing, which is reading and reacting, right? It's just the next step of writing those things down and thinking about how they might percolate into your own writing someday.
Aaron, I love hearing that about your process. When I first started, I thought that the way that you write a book is that you start on page 1 and then you get up to page 250 or whatever, and then you're done. Just write it. I don't know, I don't talk to too many writers. I can't imagine that anybody does it that way. I generally found that after I had written about 200 pages, I was asking myself, so what is this about? What am I actually trying to say? Like, have I actually said anything? And then only after the fact that I figure out what I wanted to say, and then I went back and just changed everything to reflect a point that I had not thought of until a year after beginning. So, like you said, it's about getting ideas down, and with time and with investment and with thought, it comes together, and you realize that you have something new to contribute.
I completely agree with you. It's always, as you said, interesting to hear how other writers do this, because it does seem like the sort of thing that someone would have to be a professional writer and they just know what they're going to write and they write it, and probably professional writers can do that. But for me in this book, you mentioned, we talked a little bit earlier, Sarah, about whether it was autobiographical or not and how some of my autobiographical elements ended up in it. And I knew I had to be in this book because I was taking care of these patients and I was involved in bringing them from Haiti to the US. And I wasn't sure how to be in the book, how to put myself in the book. Should I talk about myself in the third person? Should I sort of fictionalize some things? Do I really want the word I to be all over this book? And I don't want this book to be about me. And this is, for those who will read it, is not a hero's tale. This is a story of someone really struggling to try to figure out what the right thing is to do and how to do it. And as I mentioned, I got one good piece of advice, which was keeping a notebook of reflections on what I read. And the other great piece of advice was keeping a notebook that was just reflections on the writing process. And you made me think of this, Ellie, because you talked about how does a book begin? And I was trying to figure out, well, do I just begin at the beginning, or some books sort of begin at some very compelling scene? Maybe I would begin in the middle of the brain surgery of one of these patients with the surgeon, visualizing the thalamus and trying not to damage it, and then have a flashback to how we got there. And I really had no idea how to do this. And as you said, you just have to write what has to be in there, and some of those things you can figure out later. And in keeping this sort of reflective notebook that had lots of thoughts, as I alluded to, like, there's no way I'm going to finish this. You're a terrible writer. This doesn't sound like anything someone would want to read, or the stories are good, the writing is bad. You need to figure that out. I was really wrestling with, how do I put myself in this book? And I remember sort of just journaling without sort of thinking about it, just how I was thinking about the writing. And I realized that for the reader to sort of really be drawn into the story, they had to begin where I began, which was from sort of a place of naive optimism of, I think I'm a doctor and I should try to help these patients. And that's sort of as much as I could understand about it at this time. And that as things got more and more complicated, and I realized, wow, this is much more complicated than I could have envisioned, that sort of allowed me to realize and articulate through this journaling process, my naivete about this has to sort of be a main thread. And once I figured that out, I thought this needs to begin exactly at the beginning, when I first got an email that there's a patient in Haiti with a brain tumor, and is there anything we could do for him in Haiti or in the United States? And that me, as just out of residency, wanting to sort of make a big save and help this patient who is suffering, at the reader, if they begin there with me, then they'll be as surprised, as shocked, as confused, as angry, as upset as everything that comes up in this story, rather than sort of starting at the end or starting in the middle. And so a lot of these things were not obvious to me at all at the beginning. So it's interesting to hear you say that as well, Ellie, and came out both in the writing process, but also in that sort of reflective process about the process, right? What am I thinking? What am I struggling with? And just kind of journaling about that longhand in a notebook, stuff would pop out, and that would sort of give you an insight into maybe how to think about the structure of the book, or how you wanted to address some particular challenge.
Such great advice from both of you. Thank you. Ellie, you did mention a little bit earlier how you got hooked up with a potential publisher. Can you give us the rest of that story? And after that airing, maybe you can tell us how you connected with a publisher?
Well, I think what I got used to very early on was a lot of rejection, and that's a good thing to get used to, I think. I I think I just got really lucky actually that when I sent one essay as a high school student to one publisher, and they were encouraging, and I think that was probably the turning point. Had they not responded or laughed me off, I probably would have just stopped there, and that would have been a mistake. After, publishing two books with a small publisher, that's when I decided I wanted to sort of expand and sort of look for a larger press has a big reputation. And to do that, you need an agent. So most big presses don't take unsolicited manuscripts. So I proceeded to pair pitches. I sent samples and outlines and manuscripts to, I think, what ended up being 50 different agents.
Wow.
And then all 50 said no or didn't answer. And then I gave up. And then I was talking to my dad, and he said, I don't understand. Like, you did all this and you're just going to give up? And I said, well, I guess I could just keep sending out more pitches. And then I just kept doing it. And I got rejected probably by another 20 or 30. And then another one said maybe. And then another one said no, but I have a colleague who's looking for just this kind of a thing. And then that colleague called me and he said, I've been waiting for you for years. And he's like, this is exactly the kind of writing that I want to be affiliated with. And I was like, great. And I said, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to choose you. I have so many options. So, and so that was it. I mean, I think it was just like a lot of persistence. Being a writer and the publishing industry is incredibly competitive. A lot of people want to do it. A lot of people are willing to do it for very little compensation. There's a lot of self-publishing, and there's a lot of alternatives to paper books now, and it's just very difficult to break in. So if you're really interested in doing it, I think you just have to be incredibly persistent, and also know that appreciation of a piece of writing is subjective. And if you're rejected by 50 to 100 publishers or agents or whoever, it doesn't mean it's not good writing. It may also mean that it's not their particular taste or their particular interest. A lot of these agents have their areas of specialty, just like we have in medicine. It's about the right connection between a piece of writing and the author and the prospective publisher and agent.
Yeah, so interesting to hear your process and your story. And yeah, I had some interesting similar experiences. So yeah, what I was told was very similar, that you can't essentially go to an editor at a publishing house or a representative of a publishing house unless you are either already have the name recognition of being famous, or maybe if you have millions of social media followers and they see that you're someone people is interested in which case I've talked to some people who've said, oh, well, because of their writing or their social media following, an agent has actually found them and said, I'd love to encourage you to write a book and help you with that. That was not my experience. So I was told
mine either.
Yeah. So I was told I would need to find an agent. And so I was very fortunate, although as in Ellie's case have a funny story associated with it. So fortunate in the sense that as I was getting to the point that I thought I had, the 11th, 12th draft or whatever that was worth showing to someone, I thought, well, I'd better talk to my colleagues at Partners in Health, which is the NGO that I was working with in Haiti, and make sure they're supportive of this. And my hope was that they would be, because I think it shines a light on their work and their principles, and hoped it would, draw some positive attention to them. So I sent it to one of my colleagues there and said, I'm working on this and want to see if I have your blessing and also get your advice. And was very fortunate that they said, actually, a friend of someone there is an agent, and it was based in Boston, and said that they would connect me. So it sounds like it's simple, but it was not so simple. So they connected me and I was very excited. I looked at some of the other books this agent had worked on, and those authors had won Pulitzer Prizes and New York Times bestsellers. And I thought, wow, this person's going to really help me with this book. And then I didn't hear back, and I followed up a month or two later, and I didn't hear back, and followed up, and then followed up with my colleague at Partners in Health, who said, yeah, I wrote to her also. I didn't hear back, and I thought, oh, I'm going to have to find an agent on my own. This seemed too good to be true, too easy. And I tried one more time, and the person said, oh, sorry, I'm very busy. I'll try to look at it. And I thought, okay, they're not going to look at it. And then out of the blue, I was actually in Haiti and checked my email, and the agent had written back and said, I absolutely love your book, and I'm absolutely surprised that I'm even saying that, because I had every expectation that this would be awful. And call me when you're back in Boston. And I said, oh, why did you say that? And she said,
that's very honest.
Yeah, I said, do you understand she said, do you understand how many proposals we get per day? It's, agents at that level get maybe 50 proposals a day. So we can't possibly read all of them. And she said, the ones we're least likely to read are the ones from doctors, because you all think you have a good story to tell. And the truth is, most of you think you can write, but have never learned how to write. And your sense of what's interesting is not necessarily correlated with what we think people would want to read. So she said, I was really dragging my feet, and I knew I had to read this as a favor to my friend who referred you to me, and I really didn't want to do it. And I started reading it, and I thought, wow, this is a really good story, and can probably use some help with the writing, but that can be fixed. And so I was very fortunate, and this is an agent who had worked as an editor before and really helped me kind of take it from where it was to being ready to share with a publisher. So that was very fortuitous. The advice people gave me, and maybe it sort of sounds maybe like the approach you had, Ellie, how do you even know who you should write to? People told me, look, if you look in the back of any book, the acknowledgments will thank the agent. So when I thought I was not going to hear back from this person, I started going through, all the books by doctors, about doctors, et cetera, to see who their agents were and look them up and see what kind of stuff they like to publish. Because some agents are very specialized in young adult fiction or historical nonfiction or what have you. And some are more broad, and to see, who are the agents folks have worked with, and would any sort of be potentially interested in what I have. But as Ellie said, you have to be ready for a lot of rejection, even with a very personal connection. I think I was very close to the delete folder and made it out by a very small margin. But I guess just to zoom out, what does the agent do? The agent helps you sort of prepare your pitch. So she said it's actually very atypical for someone to bring a whole book. She asked me, why did you do that? I said, well, I wasn't sure I could write a book. Most people would go to an agent with a proposal and a sort of proposed table of contents and a sample chapter or two and say, this is the book I would like to write. And then the agent tries to, sort of sharpen the pitch and then sell that idea to the editor. And the editor would hopefully say, oh yeah, we want to buy this book, and here's an advance so that you can, have time to work on it and write it. But in my case, I didn't want to be in a situation where I somehow made a good pitch and couldn't deliver. So I thought I should write the whole book first. Still, she said, we're not showing the whole book to the editors because they don't have time to read that. And what we need is to find sort of the best chapter and make it the best we can do. And for you to figure out how do we sell this to someone so it's not, people don't think, oh, only neurologists are going to read this or only doctors are going to read this. How do we pull out the universal themes that an editor would say, wow, I think lots of people are going to want to read this. But as Ellie said, that is very subjective. And when the agent that I worked with sent this to probably 20, 30 editors, it was very interesting to see the comments that came back. The large majority of them said, no thanks, but for very different reasons. Some said, the story is great, but the writing is no thanks. Some said, the writing is really good, especially for a doctor. We didn't expect that, but the story is, dime a dozen, doctor helps patient, not interested. And some said we just went out with a medical book and no one bought it, so no thanks. So these are really very subjective. And the editor that ultimately we went with at Harper One read it and said, he called me and asked me what the book was about. And I gave my not very one-liner answer about these stories and global health equity and solidarity, et cetera. And he said, to me, that's not what your book is about. That's what it might be about to you or to a physician reader or a medical student reader. He said, but there's a universal story here of being faced with the decision of, which we're all faced with, of do I make whatever sacrifice needs to be made to help someone else? And if I do, what happens next? And he said that's a universal theme in this story that I think would need to be brought out to make the book more universal. So I thought, wow, that's what this person saw. Each person's here to see something different. It just depends whether you kind of your key fits in the lock. So for people who are trying to find an agent or even working with, I was fortunate to work with a very good agent, and I forget how many editors we sent it to, but for most of them the answer was no thanks. So it is a process, as Ellie said, with a lot of rejection.
So I want to close by asking each of you, what is your favorite book about neurology or medicine?
I think,
it's a hard question.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't know. I guess one that comes to mind that I always liked was Eric Kandel's book, In Search of Memory. Eric Kandel being the Nobel Prize winning scientist who studied memory formation and long-term potentiation. What I liked about that one was that it wasn't just all about the science and story of discovery, but it was also about his personal life and about how memory research really played a part in his life and his life story, which I guess goes to Aaron's point about, there is some value in inserting yourself into a story, even as one as scientific and data-driven as memory research.
As I mentioned earlier, when I was trying to figure out if I was going to do this or how I was going to do it, I went back and read a lot of books that I had really liked or had really spoken to me. And when I read them again, sometimes 10 or even 20 years later, they hit a little bit differently. I'm not sure I can pick one. We mentioned Oliver Sacks. One of my favorite books of his that I read when I was studying music was Musicophilia, which I think is a beautiful book about the patients he describes and their stories, but also a very beautiful book about music. And it's very hard to write about music. I think The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, I think, was a very impressive book about a young girl with epilepsy who was Hmong and her Hmong family in California, and how they sort of interface with the health system. And she interweaves a lot of the history and cultural elements and sort of clash of cultures story with the medicine and with sort of the spiritual elements for this family of the diagnosis of epilepsy. That was an important one. Mountains Beyond Mountains, about Paul Farmer and about Partners in Health by Tracy Kidder, who won the Pulitzer Prize, not for that book, I don't think, but for a different book. He's a writer, career professional writer, journalist writer, and I thought there's a lot of amazing craft there. I think the book that I kept going back to when I was trying to figure out how to write this book, and if the editor told me something like you need to put yourself more in it, and I thought, let me check, or you need a little bit of some type of preface, and I thought, I don't want a preface, I want to jump right in, let me check. The book I get going back to is not medical, but is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. There's now a movie, but it's an extraordinary book about Bryan Stevenson, this lawyer who tries to get people off death row, many of whom are innocent or wrongly convicted, or their sentences are way out of proportion to the crime they may have committed, and in some cases decades earlier. And it's a book that tells one main story through the whole book, and that's the story that's depicted in the movie, but also intersperses it with a lot of the history of why courts work in the way they do, a lot of the history of the areas in the South in which he practiced, and how racism gets deliberately baked into the laws. There's a lot of other stories, shorter stories about people he defended and tried to get off of death row or tried to get their sentences reduced in other contexts. And when I first read it, I thought this is a book about his work, but you don't see him as sort of writing about himself. He's writing about these stories, about the work and about the context. When I remember when my editor told me, you need to be more in this, I thought, well, let me see what Bryan Stevenson did. And I went back and saw, he's very much in it, expressing his thoughts and views and emotions, but in sort of very subtle ways that are wrapped into what's happening in the story. So not a medical book, but one I read for the stories and to learn about the work that he does. And then again and again for craft. The stories are so vivid, they're so human, they're so compelling, both the stories he's telling about the people he works with and his story. So not a medical book, but that sort of became my model for how to try to put my book together, and a book I would absolutely recommend to everyone.
Well, thank you both for sharing your stories and your own narratives of how you came across this as part of your career and use it continuously. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much for having both of us. It was great to talk with you and great to hear, Ellie, about your writing and your work. And I look forward to reading your books.
You as well.
This podcast was created and produced by myself, Sarah Schaefer. It is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. This podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of the individual participants. Music by Audrey Nath, artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast on any platform where you get your podcasts. To hear more about constructing your career in neurology, follow us on Twitter at NeuroBolts and on Facebook at Neurology Nuts and Bolts to stay up to date on new content and give us feedback on what you want to hear and tell your friends. Thanks for joining us.